G'day and welcome to the Genre Fiction Podcast. I'm Jack Roney.
And I'm Harry Colfer.
Hey Harry, let's introduce our special guest for this episode, Sarah Todman. So, g'day Sarah, welcome to the Humble Genre Fiction Podcast.
Hello, it's really nice to be invited on.
Sarah, my first question that I'm burning to ask you is that I know that you grew up, or some part in your childhood, you grew up in a pub in Charleville.
Yeah,
So
most
it's
of it.
So it's been said the love of your love of storytelling stems from a unique childhood growing up in Charleville in a pub in Western Queensland, surrounded by seven siblings. So can you
Yeah.
begin by telling us what was it like growing up in a country pub?
Yeah, well, it was definitely different. So until I was about 7, my family lived in Brisbane, and I guess we led a fairly normal suburban existence. And then, well, look, you sort of need to know my dad. He's an interesting fellow. He's done a lot of different things in his life, and he was a pharmacist, but he had this burning desire to own a hotel. And suddenly, it seemed like out of nowhere, he announced that we were going to move to this little town and he was going to take a lease on a pub. And I guess it was a different time. I have questioned my mother about why she would go, yeah, sure, with 8 kids in tow. But she said, like you did crazy things sometimes. And you had to follow his whims. So, yeah, we packed up the cars and 2 cars and headed out to this little outback town and moved in. And yeah, it was a pretty strange childhood, I guess. I think as an adult, I look back on it quite nostalgically and with pretty rose-colored glasses, I think, because it certainly wasn't perfect, but there was lots of good and definitely lots of interesting characters, and I do think that's where my love of storytelling probably stems from.
Well, let's segue now into your writings. So going back to your sort of childhood growing up in a pub in a country town, tell
Yeah.
us how you drew on your experiences as a kid living in a pub and how this inspired particularly your debut adult novel New Year's Eve, which is set in a pub in a fictional town. So tell us how your own experiences informed your latest novel.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said earlier, um, I've I've gotten older and I've got more nostalgic about that childhood, and I think that probably happens for a lot of people at the time. As a teenager, definitely, I didn't want to be in a little town. I wanted to be out in the big wide world. But when I look back on it, it really I can see it for the beauty and the uniqueness that was there. And so when I was writing this novel, the setting wasn't the idea for the novel New Year's Eve, which is actually was sparked by. So I've got 4 kids, and the youngest one, I was being induced, and so I went to see the obstetrician, and he had the number of dates that he was available, and I was to select one, and one was New Year's Eve, and I thought, oh, what a cool day to have as your birthday, because it's always going to be party time, and you'll be well celebrated. So I promptly said, yes, I'll have that day. And I went home and told my husband, and he was like, what a stupid decision. That's going to be an awful day to have as your birthday because people always have something else on. Anyway, I won, and we did have Audrey on that day, and she, quite frankly, loves her birthday. But it was just the spark of a little idea where I just started to think about, when you've got a birthday, that's a big day in the calendar year. Can it color your life in different ways? And then, I mean, I extrapolated it further to being, New Year's Eve is the last day of the year when you kind of wash off the year that was. And the first day of a new one is when you make your resolutions and you're full of hope and optimism. And that's kind of the premise of the book. Eve was born on New Year's Eve, and she feels as though her whole life it's been a bad omen. Different things have happened over the years on her birthday that have confirmed that theory for her. So I had that idea, and then I really needed to raise the stakes. And I thought, okay, she's, a Brisbane marketing executive. She's living in the city, and she can get a call drawing her back why not a little country town? Because that's what I know.
Yeah, yeah.
So, and of course, her family can own a pub. So it kind of just happened like that. And, you know, the benefit of having that pub in my head, of course, the one in the novel is fictional, but even just the layout, it was lovely to be able to visualize where things were. It is fictional, but I'm sure that both of you, I mean, you use what you know all the time, being paramedic and detective. So just being able to use those little bits and pieces was really, really helpful. Yeah.
I think I mentioned in a recent podcast that I sort of drew the line between a journalist having the experience of writing short stories because that's their job. They have to write to deadlines and things like
Yeah.
that, and it sort of trains the writing process. Do you think that that's the case for you?
I have heard interviews like that too, where, you know, people who've gone on to write fiction have said, you know, it was so great because I understood deadlines and getting things done. And a part of me, yes. One thing I think people don't talk about when you make that transition to creative writing is writing's my day job. And so sometimes, I mean, you both come from completely different worlds. And so I imagine for you, that creative outlet is this amazing release. And it is for me too. But when I'm writing all day for work, sometimes it's kind of hard to shift gears in my
Yeah.
brain to go to the creative side. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
I think I mean I as a researcher and obviously as a paramedic, I've had a lot of writing to do, but it was always work related. It was
yeah,
always, you know, very
yeah.
sort of scientific or very factual. And yeah, I when I was sort of deciding to start writing creatively, I just didn't know whether I could actually make that switch to
Oh, right.
writing into the more
Yeah.
creative style. And as I say, I just started writing um just thinking about a scene and say, okay, let's just see whether I can just write that and make it interesting.
Yeah.
And used literally jobs that I'd been to and just started writing these scenes. And that's effectively how I started,
Right.
sort of moving from the sort of factual to the creative side. I don't.
Yeah.
Was that something that you utilized, or was it?
Yeah,
How did you think?
definitely. And I think if I reflect on it, the skills that I learned as a journalist, you know, you're interviewing someone and you're gathering the gold from what they've said, and
Yeah,
you're learning how to find the angle in the story, elevate the parts that are going to be of most interest to a reader. I do think that my writing has probably benefited from those things. I feel like I understand the need to get rid of all fluff. Um, and I, you know, I just think that can be a trap for some players in those early days, definitely. And I've learnt the value and the necessity to refine, refine, refine. I'm, you know, and maybe that comes a bit harder if you haven't been writing in some form of, or another beforehand, before trying to attempt something creative. Maybe.
yeah. I remember some of my early drafts. There was, you know, I'd get to the absolute nitty gritty of, you know, blood pressure measurements and everything else when I was talking about a patient, and people, the feedback was, "Do we need to know this?" Yeah, it's like, how is this helping the story? You know, it's like it's great, it's really informative, but you know, and I was really, you know, there was something I had great difficulty working out the show don't tell sort of thing that I was like, I don't understand what that means. And
Yeah.
yeah, that was a sort of part of the learning process, was sort of realizing that I'd got on my soapbox and I was lecturing rather than actually, you know, telling this story, and I had to get back to the actual story and not lecture because
Yeah. Yeah.
because you know, you've gone from this sort of process of being a scientist to or a paramedic who has to actually tell somebody else the exact facts of a scene. And I
Yeah.
had to sort of like go, yeah, that's not necessary.
But having said that, how to perfectly pepper all the
Yeah,
little elements that give it that authenticity and that
yeah,
realism.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
It's
that
a
old
nice.
kind of cliche where I know a lot of stuff, and God damn it, my
Gotta
readers are gonna
tell
know
you, I
just how
gotta tell
smart
you.
I am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can give an example. I'm currently working on a manuscript at the moment, and it was up to over 90,000 words, and my aim was to get it back to scale it back to 80,000 words to start trimming the fat. And I've essentially done that. I've been working on it today in the last couple of weeks, and I'll tell you what, it's bloody hard when you're trying to go back through a manuscript and trim the fat. But when you start being really brutal and start working out, for example, chunks of dialogue, going back to what you were just talking about, having too much information. I had a scene where the detective was interviewing a suspect, and I was going through all the procedural questions, and then I went back and said, look, it's nice for me to show that I know, what questions have to be asked during a police interview, but is it really necessary? Does it slow down the story? So I ended up culling almost 2 pages of dialogue due to thinking, look, it's probably unnecessary dialogue. It's going through all the procedural questions. So I just kind of skimmed over that by, replacing with 2 sentences by saying the detective, covered off in all the introductory questions and then went boom straight into the first hard hitting question. So it can be pretty brutal to have to go back and to start to cull your own work, can't it?
Yeah. So maybe
Absolutely.
I'm a little bit more able to deal with that, because that's hard, killing your darlings, right? And I've had sub-editors and different people doing it my whole career.
Yes. Yeah.
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 And Sarah, you've talked about the transition from writing as a journalist, professional writing fact to writing fiction. Would you say it's a completely different type of writing, and how did you kind of make that adjustment between the two
Yeah.
styles?
It is so different. I have this really strong memory of I was working for the Martyr in Brisbane as a comms person, and we had this really groovy, clever marketing guy, and we were developing the annual review, which is usually quite a dry sort of document, just showcasing the hospital and how it's great. And he said, I want to have something really interesting for the beginning. I wanted to do like let's have a piece where you put the reader inside the emergency department. And this was before I'd done any creative writing. I, had never even thought about it. And he said, do you want to go and write something like that? And I just remember being just frozen and thinking, I don't understand what you mean. And I don't even know how I would ever do that. And in the end, he wrote it, and he wrote something fabulous. And it was years later when I, had started to get this yearning to try something creative, that I was thinking about it and thinking, my God, that was so hard to me at that time. And now I really want to try it. And, years after that, now I prefer to make things up than have to write anything factual. That's my
So where
sweet.
did that yearning come from? For someone who's a busy professional person, you got your own family, 4 kids.
Yeah,
You said your words were you had this yearning to start writing
yeah,
creatively. I guess we all have our own reasons as to why we do
yeah.
that. What was what was the trigger for you to say, one day to decide, look, I really want to try my hand at creative writing?
Yeah. I feel like in some ways, I mean, you don't know it at the time, but you think about it later, it was probably a bit of a reawakening. As a teenager, I was very into books and very much living in my head. I had very few friends. I was a bit of a nerd. And so I remember living a lot in my head and make believe, and cut to, which I'm pretty sure is a similar story for a lot of women, when you've got young children and you're at home, you sort of really wanting something that's just for you. And I was reading a lot of chick lit at the time. It was having its moment. And I was reading these books, like devouring them and thinking, you know what, like a lot of people also do, I think I could write one of these. And yeah, it sort of started there. I wrote a very terrible book that never went anywhere, but I had a lot of fun writing it.
Do you
And
think you
that
might
was
ever
kind
go
of,
back and would you ever go back and revisit that?
it
Or
was
was
too
that just you just
terrible.
kind of write that off as a learning curve?
Yeah, it was terrible. And I think I was really I've done every wrong thing you can do. I was trying to write to a style, and I in the end, the book that I've written that's been published is from me and writing what I know, and it's my voice. I was trying to replicate with the first one. Yeah.
Yeah.
You talked about how your childhood working in a pub influenced your your writing ideas for this story is a combination of the notion of someone being born on New Year's Eve, and then your setting, you decided the best setting for that was the country pub. So it was a pub in Charleville. Have you since gone back and sort of refreshed your memory? How long has it been since you've been there, or is it everything's inside your head and you're just kind of reliving the experience through your own memories, or have you gone back and done research?
I didn't go back and do research when I was writing it, which I think is probably a good thing because I really did want it to be totally fictional. And so it's good that it's not, exactly as things were, I think. But excitingly, after the book came out, I had my launch in Brisbane, which was really cool. And then I took myself on a road trip and I did another launch back in my hometown. And that was the most wonderful experience. Strange. It had been several years since I'd been back, and but it was amazing, and it was it was a really interesting thing to be in the pub again. It was quite strange, actually, to be walking around and looking at corners and nooks and crannies that I had visualized while I was writing, and to see them again after so much time. And I think also a little bit deflating because in your mind everything's in full color, isn't it? And the colors were slightly dimmed in real life. It didn't quite have the pizzazz and the color and the texture that I remember.
It's never as big either.
Yes, that's so true. That is so true. As a kid, the veranda, we just thought it was a mile long, and it is still long, but it's not. Yeah, exactly. Nothing's quite as
Nah.
big, or yeah.
I think that's
Totally.
the beauty of writing stories based on your childhood memories. I've written a book where it was it was coming of age story, and I remember what it was like growing up in 1982. And with this current book, there's some flashbacks to 1980s. And again, I'm kind of relying upon my own memories of growing up in the 1980s as a 12-year-old.
Yeah.
But I think that adds the magic to the
Oh, I agree.
storytelling, because you're
Yeah.
remembering it as you remembered it as a child. Sometimes, as you say, go back as an adult, and it doesn't meet the expectations. But those memories, those childhood memories,
Are
you
so
can't
strong.
replace those.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we imbue ourselves into them, don't we? We add to it,
Yeah.
how we felt it unfolded, whatever happened. And yeah, that is the magic, I think.
And when you
Definitely.
went back to your hometown, how were the locals? What was their sort of reaction to learning that you've written this
Yeah,
book
well, I mean,
inspired
like,
by your own experiences?
I've talked about how I'm from this big family, and I would say to you that I was probably one of the least memorable of the family because, like, when we moved there, I got all these brothers, and it's quite funny. I had a really interesting lady come to the launch, and she told a few jokes. I wanted to have a few little different elements happening, and most of her jokes were about how, the Harding boys, that's my maiden name, they were considered really hot when they came into town and everyone wanted to date them. So I was completely forgettable. So I did go back thinking, "Oh my god, no one is even gonna remember who I am." But, it was like a big warm hug that the town came out, quite a lot of people came to the launch, and, just people that you haven't seen for all these years, and, it's amazing how a lot of time can pass and you can still look at faces and instantly recognize people. So, but they were very, very warm and welcoming, and, it was an amazing night. It was lovely. Yeah.
At least with a big family, you should be assured of 10 sales.
Yeah. That's right. But it's not guaranteed because,
No,
as
it's
we've
not.
discussed, it's fiction, and once many of them realized they were not featured, they were not interested in buying or reading it.
Good point.
So, in
Yeah.
terms of the characters in your book,
Yeah.
can you give us any examples of maybe some of your childhood memories of some colorful characters who might have found their way into your book, whether either as an amalgamation of characters,
Yeah.
or are there any
Definitely.
examples where, yeah, again,
Well,
you
I
probably don't,
mean,
you're not wanting
yeah,
to identify individuals, but I'm sure
no,
there are
no.
people that really influenced your characters.
there's no one real in the book, but definitely you use the word amalgamation, and there's that there. Like the barflies, you know, as you both know, you can't have too many characters going on. So I could have had 10 regular barflies and, you know, develop those characters, but that was going to be too many. So I've kind of got a core group of 3, and that is an amalgamation of many, many people. And that was so fun. That was so fun. Just to revisit the memories of this people in little towns like that, and we got to witness it so much in the public bar, particularly their ability to tell a yarn and to make you laugh. It like the humor was actually so clever, so clever. And so I had lots of fun with that. I mean, I don't know what your favorite elements of writing are, but I think one of mine is definitely dialogue. And
Yeah.
so I had so much fun um, doing scenes with the barflies and anyone really in that little town, because it's tricky and probably risky, but I did try for inflection and, you know, slang and the way that people talk, and they drop letters, and yeah, so
I'm a firm believer in that. I know you're not supposed to, but I think
yeah,
it gives a little bit of persona to your characters. Plus
yes,
the fact you don't need to use dialogue tags because it's obvious who's talking. You know,
yes, yeah,
if they repeatedly do something in their speech, you know
yeah,
who it is, and so
yeah.
that helps a lot of the time. And there is one guy that I had in who's happened a few times. He's got a Scouse, a Liverpool accent, and
Oh,
that's always a challenge to actually get it into some sort of dialogue and
yeah,
that people can understand. But
damn.
but then there's repeatedly comments about he's really difficult to understand. But if you just wrote that as normal dialogue, then the reader wouldn't get it.
It
You know?
wouldn't work. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah, yep,
So
yep. I
And
totally
considering
understand.
that, I can kind of picture your barfly, you know, country Australian country pub barflies and the way they talk and the Aussie colloquialism and
Yeah,
slang. And um, is it a consideration thinking if you were, you know, looking at international readers, you know, whether
yeah,
they could kind of understand the slang or understand the humor? Obviously, you want to make it as authentic as you want, as you
yeah,
can, because that's part of the appeal.
yeah.
Um, but so how did you balance that?
Well, that's an interesting question, because in the editing process with Hawkeye, there was definitely some things that they asked me to soften or, you know, make more clear. But there were also other things where they may have said that, and I really held on to keeping it how it was, because I felt strongly that it worked. And I feel like I've read books where, you know, that feeling where you don't necessarily get it straight away, but it's not bothersome. It's almost like I want to read that again because I want to get the deeper meaning. So I don't know. I was hopeful that that might be the case if anyone stumbled. Yeah,
I
yeah,
think I think you can go too far though. You know, if you're writing a novel that's supposed to be set in Australia
yeah,
and everything's sort of very sanitized and you don't have any dialogue that even suggests that they're in Australia, and the only way you're going to do that is by sticking a kangaroo in every so often. I think you've sort of missed the plot there a bit with, you know,
absolutely.
if you don't add that into your story and that's sort of a little bit of slang, a bit and you know, you're going to get complaints by, you know, if it goes international and there's international buyers, they're going to complain. Some of them are going to complain because, you know, you get these people complaining on Amazon that you know, oh, it would be really good if they actually managed to spell things properly, and you go, it's international English. You know,
Yeah,
it's not American English.
yeah,
That, you know,
yeah.
you don't, you know, we put a U in color and all that sort of stuff.
Mm,
So, you know, those sort of things. I know there are editors who will remove it because it's going in the American market. Everything gets spelled in Americanized English, and
yeah,
but you know, at the end of the day, if it's supposed to be set in Australia, then you're going to have to use some of the slang,
yeah,
and American authors do it for American settings. So why
yeah,
can't we do it for Australian settings? You know?
yeah. And it's a character in the book, isn't it?
Yeah,
Where it's set. You know,
yeah,
you want that to come through. So I think that's
definitely.
really important. Yeah,
I was reading an Australian book some time ago, and obviously the wording had been changed to appeal to an American audience, where things like we refer to thongs, which are footwear, not underwear, had been replaced to flip flops and things like
Oh,
that.
yeah.
And there are other examples where you could clearly see that, you know, the language had, even though it was set in Australia, the
Yeah.
language had been adjusted so that American readers could understand.
What did
Yeah.
you call them?
Flip flops, isn't that
Flip.
what?
Yeah, that's it. I thought you said foot flops. No, they're flip flops. Flip
Yeah,
flops.
flip flops.
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
here
that's
in
it.
Australia we call them the thongs. You wear them on
They're
your feet.
thongs.
Yeah, they're not the other thong. So I guess that the next question is what have you found challenging in terms of marketing yourself and marketing your brand as an
Yeah.
author?
Yeah.
But then also conversely, what works well or what has worked well?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because you're told, you know, even before you have a published work, that you need to start building your author brand and developing this audience. I mean, I think for me, I really wanted to do something that was authentic to me and my creative bent, rather than I sort of see, I just think the most obvious thing for writers to reach for is, okay, I'll develop my brand around my writing and around maybe craft and talking about, you know, how I write, when I write, that sort of thing. But I didn't really want to go down that road. I wanted to do something that was a little, I wanted to find something that didn't feel forced or difficult for me.
I often
Yeah,
see people getting into the trends on social media, and
right.
some of it's a bit kind of it's a bit, you know, bit average. Um,
Yeah,
and you think, yeah, look, kill it, you know, people, and sometimes it comes across as being a bit over the top and fake and not authentic, and people are clearly just trying to get onto the social media, whatever's the latest TikTok trend or whatever. It's very contrived. It's not real. It's not authentic. It's not really telling the people, look, this is who I am, because obviously as an author, you've got to market yourself and your
yeah,
writing,
yeah,
and doing it in a way that's honest. So
yes.
would you say for you that's what's sort of important for you, is to present yourself as
Definitely.
you,
And I
you know?
think so. Going to my background as a journo, what is sort of interesting about me that connects to my book. So I can see that an interesting story angle, which we've talked about already, is the fact that I grew up in a pub and that I had that outback childhood. So when talking about my book, rather than having it feel like this ad, which can feel yuck, can't it? Like, look at me, look at my book. I have really tried to imbue that narrative into it. So, what's the story that I can tell around my book and how it came to be and why you might like it? So, in terms of trying to promote my book, I've done that. And in terms of having a general presence and building an author brand, I've really wanted to connect with readers creatively. And so I love writing poetry. So I feel like that's a nice way and a nice way for me to produce content that is enjoyable to read, doesn't feel like it's look at me always. It's more just an offering of something that someone could read and engage with. And I've found that to be a really nice way to, um, you know, pepper the author stuff in with the poetry.
That's good advice for any author who, you know, is thinking, I've got to get on the social media, I've got to be putting stuff out and, you know, buy my book and all that stuff. You know, I think that's the key takeaway there, is just be yourself, be authentic,
Absolutely.
identify what are your strong points, what are the things you can talk about that people might be genuinely interested in. If it comes across as tacky and contrived, people will
Yeah.
quickly scroll over it and they won't be interested, and they'll probably unfollow you if they just get sick of seeing kind
Yeah.
of this content
And
that.
finding something that's sustainable, like I say, you know, I enjoy writing poetry and it's something that I can fit into the cracks in my life. And a poem is much different to a novel that takes years to produce. And a poem I can do a few a week. And so it works into being able to have something to offer up. But really, it could be anything. And one of the other things that I really love to do, probably because of my background, is I enjoy looking at different I follow different things and see what other people are doing, just to sort of have a look out there, to spark ideas, not to, you know, try and replicate what someone else is doing, but it often sparks ideas and you see what works as well as what doesn't. Yeah, and might give a bit more confidence to try different things. I guess I'm talking about social media now. Yeah.
There are quite a lot, from what I understand, there's a lot of authors who write completely separate genres and have different names for each one, and they'll sort of diversify, but they're actually completely separate identities almost, and that would take a lot more work.
Yeah, it'd be difficult to manage, I reckon. And again,
sure.
Jack Roney's a pen name. I don't make any secret of that, but I did that for similar reasons that you did, Harry, because of our professional our careers and concerns about conflict of interest and privacy and that sort of thing. We chose to write our stories under pen names, but as a result, we built our author profile under those pen names, and to to then release a different type of book under our own name or a different pen name, different author profiles, then have to start managing different social media accounts, and
a lot of headache.
Part of that. It's a big decision to make, isn't it, in terms of how you manage all that.
Yeah.
Sarah, I've got a question in terms of the romance element to your story. So, I think I said earlier, it's been described, your story, New Year's Eve, has been described as a quirky romance, quirky Australian romance. So with a bit of Aussie grit thrown in. So what advice could you give to writers who are writing romance, or whether it may not necessarily be a romance story, but there's elements of romance in the plot? How do you keep it real?
I think, I do think it's really important, and I think it's particularly important for Australian writers. I mean, I didn't set out to write a romance book. I knew that romance was going to be a central theme. Like, I wanted to have the big romance, but I wasn't thinking, oh, I'm writing a romance book. It's got a lot of, like, it's themes of family relationships and the messiness of family relationships, coming of age. You mentioned that before. I feel like that's a really strong theme in it. And I think sometimes romance can go into those, go down that path. And so for me, I really like the idea that it's set in quite, in a very realistic setting. So the pub gave it that grit, and I really like that ensured that the romantic elements were stabilized by that, so that it wasn't wholly unrealistic. Generally I just wanted to write a story that you could feel yourself being drawn into, and have it feel real.
I think it's not to quote a sort of minor little author, Stephen King, he's sort of it's about the characters, and as long as your characters are strong and you throw them into a scene and just see what happens. And you might have started out by having this sort of idea of where the story was going to go, but then you suddenly spark into this romance that you initially didn't intend to start writing about. And I think that's part of having strong characters. And if you can set up that sort of basis of having people that in your mind, and you can actually be able to write about them and have this strong idea of what they look like and how they're going to react and what they're going to do in a certain situation, then whatever situation you throw them in, bang, then that's that stability, and that's the sort of like keeping that real is and grounded in the locality, and that's what sort of helps the story. And it doesn't matter what then happens, you can throw things at it, and then you just watch how your characters react, because you yourself know what would happen to them if they were thrown into that situation.
And I think, like, I was also thinking when I was writing, in the early days, because it took me a long time to write this book. But there was that moment where it went for a while where rural romance was such a big thing in Australia. And that didn't really feel realistic to me. Those stories were generally set on a property. And it was quite, the sweeping landscapes, and the girl falls for the guy. And I wanted more grit. And so I really liked the idea that it was in a little town that you could have visited, and again, the pub setting was, a bit rough and tumble, so that,
I think those rural romance have kind of got elements of farmer wants a wife, kind of, happy ending. It's very fairy tale kind of almost. Whereas I think something that Harry and I've learned through talking to romance authors here on the podcast is that romance doesn't always have to mean, rainbows and unicorns and happy endings and everyone's happy. It could add a significant amount of conflict and suspense, and
Yeah.
it's a real
But
tool to.
it does have to have a happy ending to be a romance, because otherwise it's a love story. You gotta get
Correct.
that.
Correct. Yes, I stand corrected. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
The romance
I
does
think
have to have the happy ending.
what it comes down to is that most stories have that romantic element because there's a relationship, right? I
Yes.
don't know
Yeah.
if either of your books have
Oh
relationships.
yes,
You
and
know,
it's something, again, it's what, you throw your characters in and see what happens, and that there was my second book didn't really have any romantic element to it, and it was commented on, but then again, that was something that happened in the first book, and
yeah,
if something happens significant in the first book, you got to give it a bit of breathing space, so you can't just jump on the next horse. And so but yeah, after that the romance does come into it, and it's not a central part of it, but it's still an important part, because it's human relationships, and that's what you're talking about. That's what stories are. We're telling human relationships, and if you avoid anything to do with sort of love interests and things like that, then it's not a full story at times.
absolutely.
And it
Yeah.
could also lead into tragedy. One element of one of my books is where someone's spouse is killed. So that sends that person down a real downward trajectory in terms
Yeah.
of wanting to seek revenge, and went into a very dark place. So I
Mm.
know I'm probably going down into a different area to what you're writing and your book is about, Sarah, but something that's been a big eye opener for me in terms of using either romance or love stories or love interests or any of those elements, that can really add such a deeper level to your story.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
The last thing I wanted to cover off before we start heading towards wrapping up is the fact that your story is set in a small town. Obviously, a lot of Australian, whether it be crime stories or a lot of recent, we talked about the rural romance and those sort of things. A lot of Australian stories, whether it's to do with the international market appeal, a lot of Australian stories seem to be set in country towns. Obviously, we still have big cities in Australia, but it
Yeah.
seems to be the fact that all of our stories, a lot of the more recent successful stories, are set in small country towns. What is it that do you think that has this kind of never-ending appeal of setting
Yeah.
stories in small Australian country town?
Well, I think you hit on one that a lot of people have either grown up in a little town or they've at least experienced life in a small town at some point, and so they are connected in that way. But I also think that there's a kind of enchantment, isn't there, about small town life that we want to buy into, and it's not always perfect or pretty in reality, but when reading a book, you know, you want to escape into another world, don't you? And there's something so enchanting, uh, comforting, interesting about a little community where everyone knows everyone else, and the gossip, and the quirkiness. Yeah, I just think that is something that forevermore stories have drawn us in, that are set in little places. And we have the beauty of Australia. When I was writing this book, I just really wanted, I don't know if I've been successful, but I really wanted to capture the beauty of Western Queensland as I remembered it, that red dirt and the mulga and the long stretches of highway. And it was, the beautiful blue skies. Yeah. So those were the things that, we talked about, looking back nostalgic and everything being in high color. But yeah, that's what I see when I think about it.
Logistically, as an author, it also does help that your number of characters is going to be limited in a small town, because
Yeah,
if you're dealing with a city, it's like that. I may have mentioned this in a previous podcast, I can't remember, but I'm currently watching The Rookie, and you've got they're in LA, and there's like 6 characters that are going to all the crimes, and 3 of them are rookies. And you go, how's that work? You've got a whole squad room here of cops, and yet every single case is these 6 characters. And you can do that in a small town. You can't do it in a big city.
Can't do it in a big city.
And, you've got to suspend a bit of your belief systems if you're having to do that. It does make it a lot logistically easier if your cast is going to be reduced simply by location.
Yeah.
And I think there's an opportunity with stories that are set in a small town where there can be sinister undertones, family secrets. People, generationally, families have been feuding or they know each other, and everyone knows each other's business. So I think that those small town environments really lend themselves for that kind of setup of, secrets and generational mysteries and all the things you can create in a small town that you can't in a city where people are anonymous. They don't have the same relationships. I think the small town setting is just such a powerful environment to base a story. Now, Sarah, we've almost run out of time, so we are going to have to wrap things up. For anyone wanting to check out yourself and your books, where can they find you online?
Instagram is a good place, Sarah Todman Writes, or my website, Sarah Todman Writer. They're probably the best places to find me, where I'm most active.
Sarah, Harry, we do need to pull up stumps now. So, Sarah, it's been absolutely wonderful speaking with you. We like to thank you for coming on and wish you all the best with your writing career. Hopefully, there are still many more books to come in the future.
Thank you both
Brilliant.
so much. It's been great to talk to you.